You're listening to Systemic Era Podcast. The failure was designed.
The Trump election trap nobody is talking about, based on an article by Robert Ray. Trump's real midterm strategy is to break the count. The story is not the polling. With 97 days left before the 2026 midterms, the relevant fact is not that Democrats are energized and Republicans are depressed. The relevant fact is that Donald Trump is already testing the seams of the election system, including an emergency Supreme Court request to salvage his mail voting restrictions after a federal appeals court blocked key parts of them. The article treats this as a list of possible moves. That is too polite. It is a catalog of pressure points in a system that still lets an openly anti-democratic president probe for openings. The source is useful as a warning, but its framing still invites the wrong kind of conversation. Not how power will be abused, but which stunt Trump will pick. The real story is that the machinery of voting, certification, and legislative seating is vulnerable enough that one man and his party can turn administrative procedure into a battlefield. Trump owns the coercive tools. The actual institutional power sits with Trump and the Republican apparatus around him. He can't personally write the election results, but he can deploy the federal state, amplify fraud hysteria, and use friendly officials to slow or distort the process. That is the difference between ordinary hardball and democratic sabotage. The article's scenarios all point in the same direction. Federal agents around polling places, claims that elections in Democratic areas are rigged, pressure on local officials not to certify results, demands on House leadership to manipulate the clerk, and the role of members. These are not random acts of chaos. They are coordinated attempts to make lawful outcomes look illegitimate, then use the resulting confusion as leverage. Intimidation is the point. The most cynical possibility is also the most familiar. Flood the voting environment with state power and let fear do the work. The article notes the federal crime prohibition on intimidation and the ban on armed federal agents at the polls. That legal language matters, but not as much as the political reality the source circles around and then half understates. The goal does not have to be mass voter removal to be effective. It is enough to create the feeling that voting in Democratic neighborhoods is being watched by hostile federal power. It is enough to make Election Day feel policed, and if litigation comes later, it comes later. The damage is already done. This is how authoritarian tactics work, when they are deployed by people who know they can outrun the courts for the duration of the vote. Certification as a choke point. The article is strongest when it describes the certification fight, because that is where procedural sabotage becomes a direct attack on representation. Trump has already encouraged local officials to refuse certification based on false fraud claims or baseless non-citizen voting allegations. More than 30 officials across multiple states have refused to certify election results since 2020, usually to help forestall Democratic victories. That is not confusion. That is sabotage with paperwork. Certification delays do not need to win in court to matter. They create uncertainty, feed conspiracy narratives, and give Republicans room to demand audits, recounts, and endless administrative review. The point is to convert a clean defeat into a cloud of suspicion. Democracy then becomes a hostage negotiation over whether the losers will accept reality. The clerk scenario is a soft coup in plain sight. The article's most revealing scenario is the January 3 House maneuver. Trump pushing Speaker Mike Johnson to fire the non-partisan clerk and replace them with a loyalist who could manipulate the role of new members. That is a precise illustration of how Democratic breakdown often happens in the United States. Not through one dramatic seizure of power, but through clerks, roles, certifications, and procedural choke points that can be weaponized by people with enough party discipline and enough contempt for legitimacy. The article notes that courts may hesitate to intervene because they treat internal legislative governance as a political question. That is the vulnerability. The system is designed to avoid judicial overreach into Congress, but that restraint becomes an opening when the party in control is willing to abuse internal process to invalidate elections. The institution meant to preserve democratic order can be turned into a shield for its destruction. Democrats need more than litigation. The source assumes Democrats will sue and probably win. That may be true in discrete cases, but it is not a strategy. Litigation, after the fact, is a repair mechanism, not a defense. If Trump and his allies can create enough delay, uncertainty, and procedural noise, then even a court victory becomes the partial loss. This is where democratic caution often becomes self-defeating. The party cannot respond to authoritarian tactics as if they were just another legal dispute. It has to name the behavior for what it is, an attempted override of democratic outcomes by executive pressure, institutional capture, and procedural sabotage. That means more than courtroom confidence. It means preparation for certification fights, public messaging that treats intimidation as intimidation, and a refusal to let the story be reduced to horse race speculation. The pattern is the point. The larger pattern is not hard to see. Trump and his enablers are not merely trying to win elections. They are trying to make losing impossible to accept and winning impossible to certify when Democrats prevail. That is the logic running through voter intimidation, mail voting restrictions, certification, obstruction, and manipulation of House procedure. The source asks what Trump is most likely to do next. The more important answer is that the threat is already visible. Use state power to muddy the vote. Use loyalists to slow the count, and use institutional ambiguity to turn democratic outcomes into partisan disputes. That is not governance. It is the method of a movement that treats democracy as valid only when it delivers the right result. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to AlterNet for today's article, with the automated voice of Libritz. Thanks for listening.